Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Spencer.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. So, if you could just start with a brief introduction to yourself and to O3 Energy, please.
Absolutely. My name is Brad Stutzman. I'm the founder and CEO of O3 Energy. O3 Energy, we are a renewable energy developer, renewable energy services company. Act as a developer, and then we also add other services as well along with that. One of our main focuses here lately has been diversifying from just solar into adding other pieces for people and companies trying to lower their energy usage.
No, absolutely. We've had a previous conversation just to get down to the nitty-gritty of understanding you and the business and things. Obviously, you've been in the business for quite a long time, like 10, 12 years or so. But like, how's that changed over the years? Like, we talked about securing capital and things like that. Like, how's your approach to securing capital evolved over the 12 years that you've actually been in business?
Yes, so I've been in the solar or renewables energy industry for about 15 years. I founded O3, it was 12 years ago. And throughout that time, we've seen a lot of changes throughout the renewable energy industry. A lot of people like to call it the solar coaster because you got a lot of ups and downs. And we've seen that throughout the years, anything from changes as far as the way the ITC works to the 1603 grant, all of the different incentives that go into renewable energy projects. You know, how we've always raised capital for our projects and for our operations as we've needed it is typically through private investors. A lot of since our projects are very heavily incentive driven, you know, with the investment tax credit and depreciation, things like that. A lot of high net worth individuals will come into our projects needing those tax incentives themselves in order to offset any income that they have from their businesses. So that's typically how we've always raised capital for our projects is through those private individuals that are needing the tax credit.
Absolutely. When you come up against projects and things like that, like, are some of the biggest challenges that you've faced whilst raising capital for renewable energy projects?
I would say the biggest hurdle that we always run into is the education process. Since a lot of these individuals or these private investors, you know, renewable energy is not their day to day business, they need to know how the projects work. They're not totally familiar with renewable energy. So, what we have to do is we have to sit down and we have to explain to them how the tax credits work and their benefits, how the projects are going to recoup cash flow and provide them the return that they need and are looking for between the tax credit and the cash from the projects. So it's always that learning curve of teaching them how about renewable energy because, like I said, a lot of these individuals are doctors, a lot of them are real estate developers, a lot of them may be in manufacturing, things that are not renewable energy. So that's kind of a learning curve that we have with them, and it's good once we get past the first project together. It makes it a lot easier for the second, the third. It's just that first project that is always a bit of a learn.
Absolutely. And I think what I've learned from these conversations on the podcast is that that education point is so valuable and so pivotal to the success of a project or a business and things. And especially when you're dealing with a client or whatever it might be in the first instance, being able to deliver the right information at the right time to give them the understanding they need to then also, well, inevitably they need clarity on the situation. So if you're able to do that in a concise manner, I think that creates a long lasting relationship. It builds a rapport also. But if you can do it in the right way in the first instance, that will create a long lasting relationship for a partnership that, like you say, doesn't just end after the first project. It goes into the second, the third, and the fourth.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of the things that you set up on the first one can just be carried over to the next project as far as documentation, things like that. And then what it's also good is you build these relationships with private individuals or investors like this, and they may have a friend, a colleague that needs tax credits themselves. And so they'll make the introductions to new individuals, to new investors, and helps with kind of the word of mouth for marketing for projects as well.
No, absolutely. And I think as a business owner, you've got to be always open to educating the market and educating different people within the market and not really being closed off at certain doors. You know, like if a certain individual that you've tested and you know that's viable for one project might not be viable for the other. So you've got to be open to testing different variables within the market. But I think end of the day, like I think if you always lead with value and that education point, you're always going to get some value or some insights back in return that you can always feed back into the marketing channels, feed back into the business to always learn and progress as a business and a business owner. Where do you feel like the education standpoint and the insights that you gather from that education has the biggest impact within the business?
I would say within the biggest impact from the things that we learn throughout projects are probably the best practices. So, the things that we learn today may impact how we develop a project or implement a project tomorrow. Some of the things that we were doing 5 years ago in projects don't make sense for us to do in a project today, and vice versa. So the industry is always changing. There's always new practices. I can give you a perfect example. 5 to 7 years ago, the idea of laying panels flat on the ground without any sort of tilt was thought of as crazy. Today, we're re-energizing one of our projects right now, and we're using a system where all the panels are just laid straight flat on the ground and there's no spacing in between the panels at all. And now with the lower cost of silicon, it makes a lot of sense. But 5 to 7 years ago, if you were to tell somebody that, they would look at you like you were crazy. And so it's really interesting how technology progresses and how best practices progress throughout this industry.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned like progressing in the industry and things, but as a business owner, you've got to have a mindset on progressing the business and future growth and things like that. So how do you actually balance using capital for current projects versus investing in the future growth of the business and opportunities?
Well, I think they go hand in hand. Investments into our projects in turn allow us to do more projects, which obviously we have some margins built into each of our projects as well, which operate our business. So, they feed each other. And by using these best practices that I mentioned before, you can bring down costs, you can bring up your margins. And so they feed each other and you just get better and better as a team, better and better as a company with the things that you learn.
No, absolutely. And I think being able to translate that to your team as well to create some sort of culture. I think cultures are very it's a hot topic at the minute within
Right.
businesses, isn't it? Having a culture within the team and being aligned as one unit. Because I think back in the day, or back before I was in business anyway, like the CEO and the owner of the business was locked behind a big door, and he was a scary person that ran the business, and you didn't really look at him. But now I think being able to lead from the front, being able to create that culture, and be able to allow people be a part of the North Star and the actual end goal of the business is really crucial to growing the business.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think company culture, I feel like, has always been important in any sort of business. I definitely understand what you mean, Spencer, about things changing over time. It was kind of the same way I remember growing up. That was, the bosses, the management team, whoever were, up in a tower somewhere that, you never really heard from them. And nowadays, I think with, a personal computer and the way that we have access to everything, through our phones, I think that that's kind of changed where as a management team, you have to kind of have an open door policy where anybody can approach you at any time. The other thing that I think we've seen over the years is good ideas come from anywhere. If you're not, if you don't have that open door policy for someone to bring you a good idea, you may miss a lot of stuff. You hear, stories of the janitor at a company coming up with a great idea for something that they saw and management team running with it, and it's a huge success. You hear about individuals like Elon Musk that has an open door policy as well, and the ideas come from everywhere. I think that that's something that you have to have today, is to have that open door policy, because visions and great ideas do come from everyone on the team, and it could be anyone. And the closer you are to the project, the closer you are to the implementation of a project, the more ideas you're going to have, because you have that hands-on approach and you're living the day to day, right? And so I think that that's very key to have a good team.
Absolutely. And I think you made a really good point of being able to bring people in from different areas of the business and things like that. And like I say, we had a little secret chat before this recording, and you were previously in real estate financing and things like that. So can you actually just walk us through that transition from real estate financing into renewables?
Yeah, so years ago, I had a previous company with my business partner at the time, and what we did was we focused on structuring and sourcing the capital for construction and development projects. Most of those projects were along the lines of real estate. And then in 2007, 2008 was whenever the Great Recession hit, and it really trickled down to Texas in about 2009 was whenever we started seeing a screeching halt in the construction and development of new real estate. So, as a team, my business partner and myself at the time, we were trying to figure out how do we continue to drive revenue in the door? How do we continue to move the business forward? And what we saw was that a lot of our developers at the time were noticing the American Recovery Act that had come out had a lot of incentives for renewables. So me and my business partner started learning how to put together the financing for renewable energy projects and some of the differences that you have from a real estate project to a renewable energy project, and started incorporating some of that into our business model. And through learning how to finance those projects, it really allowed myself to evolve in a career, because then shortly after, we started getting into the development of projects myself, and then started O3 Energy to capitalize on providing those services in developing our own projects.
Absolutely. So with that transition coming over, were there any transferable skills or any influence that you could have brought over basically into O3?
Well, definitely the understanding and knowledge of, finance and numbers from a standpoint of what banks look for in projects. That was definitely brought over, just that overall knowledge. Plus, I think a lot of it has to do with kind of grit and determination of never, giving up. Always evolving. There's always a way to make something, to change something, and to get better even in times that are a little bit difficult. And so, being in the solar industry now, there's always those ups and those downs, like I mentioned before, the solar coaster, and you just got to work your way through it. And I think some of those traits carried over to O3. And with some of the things that we're going through now as an industry, with the Trump funding freeze, now some of the Trump tariffs, I think that those are things where we're going to have to pivot, make some adjustments as well in order to continue to be successful. And we've always got to be learning from experiences and how we can make some changes.
I think you made a really good point there about being able to pivot and be adaptable to situations in business. I think as a small business owner of a team of maybe 3 or 4 of us, what we pride ourselves on is being really agile. Like, so we can pivot in any direction at any point with no real questions asked. And I think that ability to and that agility to actually pivot when needed, and especially now with the tariffs coming in and different policies within the industry coming in as well, that ability to be adaptable and to be agile, I think that's really key. So, like, how do you actually stay agile and adaptable in a market where it's up and down, like you say, the solar coaster? How do you stay adaptable?
I would say constant education. That's one of the biggest things. Anytime that I notice that I have any gaps in my schedule, I'm always jumping on some sort of webinar or training, so that you can get a feel for what's coming down the pipe in the future and kind of start working towards making those adjustments or coming up with ideas on what you're going to do whenever you do get to that point. So that's one of the things that I focus on myself, is constant education, constantly reading up on what's going on in the industry, things as far as changes that are coming along. I would also say, continue to always discuss those things with your team. Get those ideas, and that those juices flowing as far as brainstorming. How are we going to attack this? How are we going to attack that? And just continue to have some good communication with everyone across the team.
No, absolutely. And I think that that communication goes into the work that you do and the ability to deliver a high quality product, a high quality service, and then leads into word of mouth referrals and things. And like you say, you mentioned that word of mouth referrals is one of the best client acquisition channels that you can have. I think it's puts a certain crown on the jobs that you do, and it also you can't get better than the reviews that you get. I think if someone tells someone else that you've done a good job, they can sell your product or service better than you can. And because at the end of the day, it comes down to trust. And if you're able to deliver that product and service higher than everyone else and someone else talks about it, that is one of the most effective ways to actually grow the business. So, like, how have you managed to grow the business as big as it has been through word of mouth referrals?
So, we have several different avenues. Word of mouth referrals, I think, is always the best. With us being in the United States, we get inundated with so much advertising, so much marketing that a lot of times we become numb to it, if that makes sense. But, if one of your friends or one of your colleagues is saying, hey, look at this group for what you're working on. This is a good group. They're going to kind of go to the forefront whenever you're searching for a new company to work with for a certain service or product. And so that's where we try to keep try to keep those good relationships is to continually focus on word of mouth along with our presence online. We make sure that we constantly have updates coming out through our websites as far as what we're doing as a company, and same thing through social media as well. So I think that kind of supports that word of mouth. So, if someone hears about us, they can go online and check us to make sure that we're a real company and we're doing real stuff and see some of the projects that we're working on. And the pictures are worth a thousand words, right?
Absolutely. And like, how do you actually identify and then develop these long-lasting partnerships like we talked about at the top of the podcast? Like, is there a certain criteria? Like, do you look for certain attributes within a project or an investor? Like, how do you actually develop these long-lasting partnerships?
Yeah, so some of the things that we do is we work with groups that we feel are going to have more than just one project, right? So we'll really focus on attacking a group that may have a pipeline of projects. So, say aligning ourselves with a real estate development company, or aligning ourselves with a city that may have several facilities, aligning ourselves with a church group that may have several facilities, nonprofit that may have several facilities. We've done really well as far as that goes, not just focusing on the one-off sort of transactions. So, like for instance, this past week we were meeting with several real estate development groups and general contractors. They're always looking at real estate projects, always trying to figure out how to increase the return of those real estate projects, and cutting down on utility costs is a huge benefit for them. So why not work with those groups that constantly have those projects and build that relationship with them so that you don't have to consistently go out and market for new projects.
Absolutely. And let's talk about those projects then. I think like I say, we've had a little bit of a brief chat prior to this. Microgrids and energy storage has been a a key factor in the renewable energy industry. And it's been a hot topic on the podcast as well. We spoke to a few people about microgrids and energy storage. But how do you actually see microgrids and energy storage transforming the commercial and industrial energy landscape?
Yeah, so, traditionally, it seems like most of the groups that we worked with wanted to look at on-site solar generation. That's been our main focus. Over the years, the groups that we work with have said, hey, we want some backup power, some resiliency, which with solar just in itself, you have to disconnect the system if the grid goes down. So, if there's a large storm that comes through and the grid goes down, the solar system has to shut down itself on a behind the meter sort of system. And that's not a fault of solar itself. That's just a fault of safety on the grid. The utility doesn't want workers going out there working on power lines and someone's solar system's feeding back onto the grid, and they get electrocuted, right? So there has to be those controls in place on an on-site system so that it can cut off from the grid and island itself. And in order to do that, you need batteries or some other energy source as well along with it. And so that's really where the demand for microgrids has started to come around. We've been seeing more and more of that. The winter storm in Texas a couple of years ago, that really sparked a lot of it here in Texas. A lot of groups, first to start off with homeowners, now it's, going over into commercial as well. There's been a huge demand for that resiliency. Everything nowadays is powered by electricity. It's changed from a want or a luxury into a need. You need it for everything. Everything in your house, everything in your building runs off of electricity. So the more and more there is a demand for electricity, the more and more it's a huge hindrance whenever you lose electricity. Not only in your climate control, your HVAC, but if you have refrigeration or other large machinery on site, you lose the electricity for that. You could be losing inventory. You could be losing the costs for having to restart some of these large machines. You don't have a restart time as well. So just the cost involved in that, it makes sense to go ahead and add some resiliency with the microgrids so that you don't have to deal with the issues that come from losing electricity on site. So that's really why we've been seeing more and more of the demand for microgrids.
No, absolutely. And I think through the conversations I've had on the podcast and speaking with clients and things within the industry, I think the centralized grid itself is kind of an old-fashioned way to look at it. I think it used to be, yeah, it used to be great 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but now we're using more power than ever. AI is coming in, data centers are needed more than ever. So there's massive draw of electricity from the grid, and being able to supply rural communities or sports stadiums or a section or a commercial building that draws a lot of electricity through the day to day with a microgrid, having power on site. I think also, like you say, you mentioned resilience, which is a very key word at the minute. It's like being able to not rely on the grid is absolutely key at the minute.
Right. Well, and then also, you also got to look at the simple fact that the the groups, the utilities that are running the grid have a monopoly on everything, right? You can't just change who you're connected to, with the grid. So, having a microgrid, you have a little bit more control over your situation, even above and beyond the resiliency, right? We've worked with some groups that, are running generators, have batteries and have solar, and they're all, fine and dandy. We have a, resiliency, but we're doing it to save electricity from the grid. These groups that I'm talking about are in Southern California, and if they're drawing from the grid, they're paying 30 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour, and their levelized cost on their microgrid is coming out to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, if not less, depending on what they're running at the time, and it just makes more sense for them to generate their own electricity versus pull from the grid.
No, absolutely. For me, I think it's very frustrating because I think it goes back to the education standpoint. I think because of people look at the renewable energy industry as this complex beast and it's brand new and solar's brand new and oh, I don't understand it. But solar's been around for 25, 30 years. It's not this new thing. And I think if a lot of people knew the benefits of solar and what it could do for not only businesses but for homes and rural communities and community solar and things like that, I think it would be widely adopted. But what do you think are the barriers that still exist within the industry in terms of microgrids?
The barriers that exist from a microgrid standpoint, some of the barriers are, I would say, are costs in some situations. So, it depends on what you're implementing, but there are some, there are a lot of costs with putting together a microgrid. So it may not make sense in every situation, and you really have to weigh the pros and cons with, your business or whatever you're putting that microgrid on. I would say that's the current biggest barriers right now. Regulation is also another barrier as well, depending on, what some of those utilities may let you connect or run in parallel with their grid whenever whenever your microgrid is connected to the grid, depending on how it's set up. So there's cost and then regulation as well, which I say are probably the biggest hindrances.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And we just talked about community solar there and session about it. But what actually attracted you to the community solar space, and how does it already like complement your existing business models and things like that?
Yeah, so O3 Energy, we've developed CNI projects and small utility projects for a while now. Community solar's become more and more popular. And as utility scale projects have gotten larger and larger and larger, they've kind of gotten a little bit too large for us to attack as a company. Years ago, the average utility scale project was say 20 megawatts. Now, here in Texas, they're building, hundreds of megawatts, gigawatts almost, and those need to be left up to the big boys in the industry that can carry that cash flow. As a company, we're not set up for something that large. So, our sweet spot is probably going to be, from the kilowatt size on up to 10 to 20 megawatts, in that range there. And community solar, on average, the average size project is typically, I would say, around 5 megawatts for average community scale solar project. So, it really fits our spot of where we're at as far as a company goes. And we've just been seeing the popularity more and more across the board, across the US, as more utilities are looking at ways to provide solar for those customers in their territories or on their grid that don't have access to put solar on their roofs. So they don't own their home, they don't own their real estate, they rent, they have a lot of trees above their property. And so that's where community solar's gotten more and more popular. So for us, it just fits us as a company. It makes a lot of sense from a development standpoint, and kind of just fits in that box of the characteristics of the projects that we're already attacking, and just adds another avenue for us for projects to attack.
Absolutely. Brad, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. But before I let you go, I've got a couple more questions.
Yes,
Question number
sir.
one is, where do you see O3 Energy in the next 3 to 5 years? Where are the opportunities for you guys? What are you going after?
Yeah, no, I think we covered a lot of it on the here earlier, and a lot of it's those microgrids. Like I said, we're adding more and more to our product offering right now, above and beyond the solar. So microgrids, demand response along with those microgrids, the batteries, generators, and also taking a look at controls to bring down the overall usage of electricity at the properties. So, a lot of times properties are just run inefficiently, and there's a lot of loss as far as electricity goes, just because of the way it's been run inefficiently. And so those are some of the things that we're attacking from a company to provide better solutions for our customers. So that's where I see us moving as a company, is more as a true ESCO, and not just as a solar developer.
Absolutely. And for the listeners, where can they find you? Have you got a website? Are you on LinkedIn? Where can the guys go and find
Yeah.
what you guys do?
Yeah, so our website is energy.com, and that is the letter O, the number 3, energy.com. And you can find us on there. We're also on LinkedIn, and also have a huge social media presence as well. And it's just O3 Energy across all the social media platforms.
Brad, like I say, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Spencer.